There once was a time in the history of speed when sports car supremacy was a European domain that swept across the racetracks of the world with shameless bravado. During the 1950s, cars that bore names such as Ferrari, Jaguar, Maserati, and Aston Martin reigned proudly over the automotive kingdom with power and handling, which secured their rightful places in the hierarchy of grand touring cars. In America, only one production car dared to challenge its European counterparts in the arenas of performance: the Chevrolet Corvette. It was called America's only true sports car. And although that might have been true, by the early 60s, the Corvette's racing successes were more national than international achievements. But then again, America's racing compass point was headed in other directions in the decade of the 60s. The late model stock cars of NASCAR, the quarter-mile dragsters competing in the National Hot Rod Association, and the United States Auto Club's oval racers blasting around the brickyard had lured most of America's racing enthusiasts some distance away from sports car consciousness. And by the middle and late 60s, the muscle car phenomenon was the most influential stream of consciousness on the domestic automotive agenda. There is a man who, in only a handful of years, brought automotive thunder to the world of high performance and gave America the most furiously fast sports cars that have ever been built. Cars which made America the country to beat in a sport that Europeans had invented and dominated in with predictable regularity for decades. Until this quick-witted Texan, with a sparkle in his eye and an unquenchable desire to guide his dreams into the daylight of reality, brought a bunch of unknown but ingenious hot rodders together for an oh-so-short but oh-so-glorious quest for excellence. His name is Carroll Shelby.
Boy, how would you like to be driving that baby? Some thrill. But you know, before that pilot could fly from coast to coast in 3 hours plus, somebody had to invest about 1 million hours getting him ready for it. There's a lot of designing, testing, and trial runs behind every new innovation or new performance record. How do I know? My name's Carroll Shelby, and performance is my business.
Carroll Shelby was born in Leesburg, Texas on January 11th, 1923. His desire to become a race car driver began to emerge in his teen years. But it wasn't until 1952, at the age of 29, after a few less than successful career attempts, that he actually began driving sports cars in sanctioned racing events.
Well, I was in the chicken business. The story's been told 1,000 times. And all the chickens died with the Limberneck or Newcastle's disease, as it's called. So I'd always wanted to be a racing driver. I was 29 years old, and I said, to hell with it, I'm going out and do that. And a friend of mine had an MG, Ed Wilkins, in Dallas, MGTC, and we'd been trying to build us a Chrysler Special with a Hemi engine. And to make a long story short, we went up to Oklahoma to a race in his MG, and I won the race, and from there on, it was about a 3-year struggle before I was driving for the Aston Martin team in Europe.
Early on in his racing career, he would go directly to the racetrack from his other job, still wearing his bib overalls. It would become a Shelby trademark.
I didn't drive very long. I didn't drive race cars but 9 years because I had the heart problem that I got in 1959.
Carroll Shelby's short race driving career was nevertheless a brilliant one. He won 3 national drivers' championships in 1955, 57, and in 1960. In 1956 and 57, he was named Sports Illustrated Sports Car Driver of the Year. He won a record 19 consecutive races in his 1957 championship season. And in 1959, scored his greatest racing success as he and co-driver Roy Salvadori won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in an Aston Martin DBR1. helping Aston Martin to win the World Manufacturers' Championship that year. He drove Formula One cars for Aston Martin and Maserati for a short time. But in 1960, he learned that he was suffering from a heart condition. He won the United States Road Racing Club Drivers' Championship that year, sometimes competing with nitroglycerin pills under his tongue in the event of chest pains. Then, in December of 1960, Carroll Shelby retired as a race driver. In 1989, at the Monterey Historic Races at Laguna Seca, a special tribute was held to commemorate Aston Martin's and Carroll Shelby's victory at the 1959 24 Hours of Le Mans. The recreated pit area was a colorful backsplash to the lineup of the fully restored Aston Martins which competed in that great race, looking just as menacing as they did 30 years ago. Aston Martin team drivers from the 1950s also reunited at the event in Ireland.
It was almost a family atmosphere, I think, and which included all the mechanics. And when one drove at Le Mans, we all stayed in the same hotel with the mechanics and everybody. And dinner was always with everybody present, and it was just a wonderful, warm feeling that you got from. And they were very serious about what they were doing, and so I think that's probably the large part of it.
The great Stirling Moss.
I can tell you more things that were wrong with the Aston, but having said that, it was one of the best balanced and nicest handling cars that I ever drove. And it's because of the car's superb balance and characteristics that the car did so well. I mean, its win at Le Mans to me is even more remarkable than any other success because it was not really a Le Mans car.
And the 1959 winning team, Carroll Shelby and Roy Salvadori, along with the DBR-1 that Shelby and Salvadori drove to victory. It was a day for reliving fond memories.
Yeah, I have a lot of fond memories about it. You know, the thing that I remember about it is such a wonderful handling car, and although it might not have been quite as fast as Ferraris, we usually got them just on handling alone.
The first American to win the World Driving Championship in 1961, and a former teammate and employee of Carroll Shelby, Phil Hill, was there and duly impressed.
Recreating the 1959 Le Mans pit right here at Laguna Seca. That's about as extraordinary a thing as anyone could do.
Another very famous fan of Shelby's was also there. Comedian and Tonight Show guest host Jay Leno, who owned several Shelby vehicles.
Yeah, you sure did. You sure did. I've been...
well, it's just fun. I mean, I'm a big car guy, so this is great fun. I'm having a lot of... It's terrific. You know, this is what I do. It's like the ultimate garage.
This event was not the only one in which Carroll Shelby's driving successes were showcased. A year earlier at Laguna Seca, Maserati was the car being honored. And once again, Shelby, Moss, and Hill were reunited. Although Carroll Shelby's career as a driver ended in 1960, his association with automobiles and racing was on its way to even more dramatic heights. His experiences behind the wheel of some of Europe's most successful race cars had planted a great undeniable seed, one that would now begin to germinate.
The reason I wanted to go to Europe was because I wanted to learn how Ferrari, Maserati, Aston Martin, all those teams built their cars, and ran little automobile companies, and that was a double reason for me not only to drive race cars, but I wanted to learn how those little companies work. And I found that out, and when I quit in 1960, I started building the Cobra.
And his brief relationship with an American hybrid sports car had also fanned the flames of his creative vision. The Allard, the car which Sidney Allard had built for several years in the 50s, was the combination of a lightweight chassis and body and powerful American engines, such as Ford side valves, Cadillac and Chrysler V8s. Carroll Shelby drove the Allard a number of times, and fellow Texan Tom Turner is a noted Allard collector and vintage racer.
It was the first development of the big engine in the European chassis. And we asked Carroll Shelby one time where he got the idea for the Cobra and said, did you think I got it? And he, of course, the Allard was the first big car that he ever drove.
1962 was the year that the first Cobra prototype was built. In February of that year, as any Cobra enthusiast can tell you, the end result of one of history's greatest strokes of coincidence came into being.
Everybody's heard that story, I guess. I borrowed an engine from Ford. I got A.C. to build a chassis to take the V8 engine. Everybody thought that we just took an A.C. chassis, but it was much more complicated than that. We had to change the chassis. Although the chassis was the same type of design as the Chigiro chassis from many years before that, it was a lot heftier and beefier to take the 400 horsepower that we were putting in it versus the 120 for the little A.C. Bristol engine.
Rick Kopech is the president of the Shelby American Automobile Club, one of the most devoted groups of automotive enthusiasts in the world. He is a friend of Carroll Shelby and one of today's most knowledgeable historians on Shelby and his cars.
Well, someone once said that timing is everything. And I think we can look back over 25 years of hindsight and see that Shelby was the right guy in the right place at the right time with the right idea. And he went to Ford right when Ford was on the edge of their total performance project. They wanted to be known in NASCAR, in IndyCar, in sports cars, and in drag racing. And Shelby was the sports car connection. He came to them with an idea to put one of their engines in a sports car. They were warm, they weren't red hot, they were lukewarm, and Shelby was enough of a promoter to get them involved and to keep them involved. And his ideas of where he wanted to go happened to coincide with where Ford wanted to go, and Ford was happy to let him do the driving to get him there.
The 260 Ford V8 dropped into the A.C. Roadster created an explosive combination of power and acceleration that made a mockery of the performance envelopes of any production car being built here or abroad. The Cobra had been born. As a street car, the Cobra didn't pamper its driver or passenger. Its sole purpose in life was to be the fastest, wildest, most uncivilized driving experience money could buy. And if it scared the bejesus out of you in the process, so be it. In September of 1962, Road and Track magazine road tested an early production Cobra. It went from 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds. Drivers of other performance cars read those numbers and swallowed hard. The 260 V8 was soon replaced with the 289 Ford V8, which made the Cobra an even more carnivorous creature. In the autumn of 1962, in a small industrial complex in Venice, California, Carroll Shelby got on with the job of preparing the Cobra for real warfare, national and international racing, and to tackle the daunting task of developing a winning race car in 1962. Shelby's dancing partner was the Ford Motor Company.
After Ford decided to jump in bed with me, they put some good people out helping me. Sometimes they were help and sometimes they were hindrance because I knew what I wanted to build. I knew that you couldn't compromise it. And I was shooting for a little niche market. Now niches are all over the place. There's a lot of niche markets, but I didn't want to build but about 500 cars a year to begin with.
The first racing encounters of the early Cobras were a mixed bag of successes and failures. Every race smoked out another part or subsystem that needed improvement or upgrading. By 1963, with many of the mechanical shortfalls corrected, Carroll Shelby's spectacular juggernaut of racing championships got up to speed. That year, the Cobras won both the S.A.A.C Production National Championship and the newly organized United States Road Racing Championship. The Cobra would also become a national drag racing champion in the National Hot Rod Association. And while these were admirable jewels in the Shelby American crown, 1963 was not a rewarding year for the Cobras at international events such as Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans. It was in the following year that Shelby Team Cobras would begin to dismantle their overseas competition.
We wanted to go international racing, and the old 289 Cobra was about as aerodynamic as a shoebox. So we got together, Pete Brock, Phil Remington, Al Dowd, several of the fellows around the shop, and Pete Brock came up with a sketch. I'd say the team was Pete, Phil Remington, and Ken Miles. And we came up with a car that went from 150 miles an hour with 400 horsepower to 200 miles an hour.
It debuted at the Daytona International Speedway on February 16, 1964, hence the name Daytona Coupe. Its first GT win occurred at the 1964 race at Sebring, and there were several other GT victories for the sleek Cobra that season. In fact, 1964 might have been the year that Carroll Shelby's aluminum-bodied Snakes won the World Manufacturers' Championship. With 3 events remaining, the Cobras needed to show well in at least 2 to capture the necessary points for the championship. But one of those events was in Italy, where Enzo Ferrari wielded enormous clout.
We should have won the World Championship in 1964 with it, but old man Ferrari, being a rascal that he was, got the last World Championship event at Monza canceled. So we had beat him 5 straight races up till then, and he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he got it changed. But we nailed him next year, so it doesn't make any difference.
Carroll Shelby was a success in building the cars he built because he had the ability to see the goal that he wanted, to envision that, and then to find the people who could best help him meet that goal. One of the examples of that is Pete Brock when he designed the Daytona Coupe. Here was a guy that was a real young guy out of General Motors design school. He had some experience working on a Corvette. He really didn't have a lot of experience with wind tunnels and with aerodynamics, but yet he had a sixth sense that Shelby must have picked up on in order to put him in charge of that project. You wouldn't just pick somebody off the street to do that. And so Pete Brock designed this car by the seat of his pants, and it worked.
Carroll Shelby's Cobras did indeed go on to win that elusive championship in 1965. An accomplishment that becomes even more remarkable when you consider that only 6 Cobra Daytona Coupes were ever built. And it was in only their second full season of international competition that the Shelby team won a championship that Ferrari had won almost effortlessly in 1963, 2 brief years earlier. And even more remarkable yet, a championship no other American car had ever won, before or since.
The Cobra Roadster was the one that I had the most experience with, although Pete Brock, a young design engineer who was also very creative, got very brave and went out and designed a coupe and did a terrific job on that. And it still looks good and it still performs well even today. But the origins, the Southern California origins, which include what was the hot rod phenomena from the dry lakes and the illegal racing on the streets in post-war California, and also later on the beginnings of drag racing, which still goes today. That was the progenitor, or that's where the Cobra really came from, and it was a hot-rodded Ford engine, and this A.C. Cobra chassis, the marriage of that plus the rim and the rest of the engineers that put it all together, it was an interesting and unique automobile that was able to get the job done.
The Cobra was nothing but a hot rod. The Scarabs were nothing but a hot rod. The big Ferraris were a hot rod. Big engines, light chassis, big brakes. I think that what went on in America in the late 50s, bringing out these hot rods and showing that they could compete with the best that the Europeans built, showed American ingenuity, and it helped a lot of us Americans get to Europe and get jobs over there because we had these hot rods to go win the races with and beat those Ferraris and so forth.
In 1965, perhaps the most notorious car to wear the Shelby name, entered the fiercely fought muscle car rebellion and with startling immediacy took over sole control of the mean streets, the 427 Cobra.
First we put a 427 in a 289 chassis. And Ken Miles tested it. We called it the Mule and worse names because we knew that Chevrolet had said they weren't in racing, but they were secretly building the Grand Sport. And we would have had the 427 and a 289 chassis ready for them, but Ken wrecked it, and they'd never gone to to Nassau and beat the Cobras if Ken hadn't wrecked the car when we were testing it. However, that's where the 427 came from, and Klaus Arning, one of the Ford engineers, it was the first car that was laid out, chassis was laid out on computer. He's the one that did it. Phil Remington went over and to S.A.A.C cars and a couple of the other guys, and we put the car together all in 3 months, and we're producing it. And we had to do it to, in case Chevrolet had gone ahead and produced their lightweight Corvettes, which they went out of the business when they saw us building the 427 Cobras. So I was sorry to see that, because it would have been a lot of fun to race, to race them.
The 427 Cobra's racing exploits were largely confined to national events in 1965, since an insufficient number of them were built in time to qualify for international competition. The A Production Championship of the S.C.A.C was to be sole property of the 427 Cobra for the remainder of the decade. And on the streets, the 427 Cobra attained so fearful a reputation, few dared to challenge it. It could accelerate from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. It ran a 12-second quarter mile on street tires and could accelerate to its top speed of 165 so quickly, cars with higher top speeds would have needed half the county to catch it. And when Ken Miles blasted from 0 to 100 to 0 in 13.8 seconds in a 427 Cobra wearing street tires, a level of performance was set of such stunning magnitude that no other production car has ever equaled it.
The 427 Cobra is probably the car that more people have lusted after who have never driven one or have never even ridden in one. It's shrouded in legend and in mystery. They didn't make very many of them. When you think about all the cars that were made in numbers, they made about 350 of these cars. Most of the mystique is because they came on the heels of the 289 Cobra. The 289 Cobra really was the car that gave the Cobra its name. It became a household word. People thought that that was the fastest sports car ever made, and it was the fastest production car ever made until Shelby came out with the 427, which was even faster. And he did something that up until that time no one had even thought about doing, was putting a big block NASCAR engine, a 450 horsepower engine, into a 2,500 pound sports car. And you were driving really little more than an engine with a seat behind it. The cars have had a mystique. They were the high water mark in performance. They would go from 0 to 60 faster than you could catch your breath. If they had the right rear end, they would top 200 miles an hour. They would break the rear wheels loose at any speed in almost any gear. And it was the kind of thing that you saw a car like that once and you remembered it the rest of your life. You didn't have to drive it. I know people who have, they remember very distinctly seeing the car like that back in 1966 when maybe they were 16 or 17. And they remember the first 427 Cobra they ever saw. I mean, I remember the first one I saw, just like it was yesterday.
And while the 427 Cobra was solidifying Carroll Shelby's place in muscle car history, another Shelby creation was emerging from the same Southern California gene pool from which the Cobra had hatched, taking a horse and giving it the fangs of a reptile.
Shelby Mustang came along because I.A.C. went to Sport Car Club of America and says, we're going to make the Mustang a sport car. And I didn't know about this till about a month later. They'd gone to John Bishop and told him that they were going to make it a sport car. And he says, well, it's not a sport car. It's a four-seat car. It's not a sport car. Finally, when they told I.A.C. they couldn't make it a sport car, he called me and said, can you make it a sport car? So I called my guys together, the people that I worked with at Ford and the people that, the Al Dowds and the Phil Remingtons, and said, can we make this a sport car? And then I called, we decided we could, and then I called John Bishop and said, John, what does it take to make the Mustang a sport car instead of saying, we're going to make this a sport car? And he says, oh, hell, Shelby, says that's pretty simple. Said, take the back seat out and change the suspension around so that it handles better and it's not a little old mushy six-cylinder. They'd started putting the V8s in them then. And so I got them to build a high-performance 289 V8. We took the suspension and changed it. We put a large rear end in it with a limited slip, took the rear seat out, and went out and beat the hell out of the Corvettes with it.
The question of Shelby's cars, I guess, comes down to, are they sizzle or are they steak? And there's a lot of both. I think there's so much sizzle that sometimes the smoke overpowers you and you get caught up in it. They certainly were everything they were meant to be. They were ultra high performance, they accelerated well, they brake well, they handled well, and they won races. And you can't ask for much more than that.
This GT350 is a racing version of Ford's Mustang 2+2. We set the cars up for racing by installing special components, racing shocks and so on. We're doing a lot of testing as well. This is Willow Springs Raceway, tucked away in the Mojave Desert. It's where we do much of the testing for our new cars. The interesting thing about testing out high-performance automobiles is that you can only do it with top drivers who can take the cars right up to the maximum. We've got with us today Pete Brock, head instructor at our driving school. Pete's behind the wheel of the new Mustang GT350.
The Shelby GT350 began life in 1965 as a rough-and-tumble performance fastback with power, handling, and blue-chip pedigree. It immediately dusted its competition, including the Corvettes, in the S.A.A.'s B production category on its way to the national championship in 1965, 66, and 67.
If there was a negative with the Cobra, it was that the Ford dealers found it very hard to associate that car with the other cars on their showroom floor, whereas a Corvette was very clearly a Chevrolet. But when Shelby came out with his version of the Mustang, of course that was much easier. It was obviously a Mustang, and yet there was something about the car that if you saw one coming at you down the road or in a parking lot, there was just something about the silhouette of that car that you knew it was more than just a Mustang. I think the tires filling up the wheel wells, just the aggressive stance that the car had, the stripes, the hood scoop, the hood pins, the things that you were used to seeing on a real race car, and at that time you didn't see them on street cars. You look at a 65 Shelby Mustang, they were sold for $4,800. That was a lot of money for a Mustang. When you could pay $3,000 for a loaded Mustang, I don't think you could pay $4,800 for a Galaxy. So it was an expensive car. It was a racing car that they had detuned to put on the street. It was different. I think one of the interesting things about the Shelby Mustang project at the very beginning was that whenever anyone builds a high-performance version of a standard car, a Camaro, a Z28, is based on the car, the standard version that they sell. What Shelby did was took the race car and detuned it to make the street car instead of taking a street car and hopping it up to make it a race car.
It was clear that Carroll Shelby's great flair for inspiring greatness in others through his leadership and loyalty had allowed his motley crew of racing upstarts to reap a whirlwind of success in an astoundingly short time.
In the early days, everybody had to do 3 jobs. The marketing man had to be the salesman, sometimes a janitor, sometimes the chief engineer had to be the chief mechanic, or had to wipe the cars off, clean them up. So it was really a very interesting time. We had a lot of spirit around the place over in Venice, California at that time, and I longed for those days because I had more fun then building cars than I ever have since then.
We've been publishing the Club magazine for 17 years, and during that time we've interviewed a lot of people who worked for Shelby. I'm always joking that we'll never run out of people, but it seems like to a person, every one of them has said that the time that they spent with Shelby American and the Cobras and Carroll Shelby was probably the high point of their life, although they didn't realize it at the time. At the time, they were just people doing a job, whether they were building race cars or driving them or building street cars, and it was a job like any other job that they've had. You never know where it's going to go, and you never know that you look back through the hindsight of history 20 years later, and it's going to be one of the more famous or important things that you've ever done. But at the time, they got a lot of personal satisfaction, they had a lot of enjoyment, and they certainly experienced success, which is enough to pump you up and keep you going for the next round.
Meanwhile, after the World Championship season of 1965, Carroll Shelby had become more directly involved in Ford's ultimate quest, winning the 24 Hours of Le Mans with its Ford GT.
Well, we did all right the first couple of times out. The field of cars were very impressive at Daytona and Sebring. Now we're getting ready for the big ones overseas, Monza, Targa Florio, and Le Mans. In the weeks to come, we hope to continue our string of victories. It's a cinch that whatever success we find, we'll also find our share of disappointments. Motor racing is that way. It's a rich mixture of heartache and joy. For those of us who participate in this most exciting of sports, the Ford people, our crews, drivers, whatever the outcome, racing becomes a never-ending pursuit of excellence.
Hal Sperlich and Ray Geddes and I went to Europe and hired John Wire, who used to run the Aston Martin team, and we took Eric Broadley in, but and bought the rights to a car that he had done, a low rear engine, midship engine GT car, but he couldn't stand the Ford politics, and being the independent cuss that Eric is, I can't say that I blamed him, because he knew what he wanted to do, and he didn't need 3,000 engineers telling him what he ought to do, and 15 marketing people telling him what he ought to do, and everybody having a different opinion of what you ought to do, and so he pulled out of it. But the GT40 evolved from that. John Wire put the people together over in England, and that's where the GT40 came from. Then we did a lot of work on it, but we didn't do any of the initial design work. That was John Wire and Lynn Bailey, and we did a lot of development work in it. We raced it, and when the GT40 really became viable, though, was when Bill Ennis and all those wonderful engineers, O'Sullivan that built the first Ford Flathead, built us a 427 aluminum engine and put it on the dynamometer and ran Le Mans with an engine and gearbox 3 or 4 times. If it broke, they fixed it, strengthened that part, and that's the reason we went to Le Mans and won in '66 and '67.
Ford would achieve their Le Mans victory in 1966. Ford GTs would finish first, second, and third, with the top 2 finishing cars, the ones prepared by the Shelby team. Several months later, the Shelby American team would suffer an immeasurable loss. One of the most valuable members of the Shelby American success story, who had come aboard in early 1963, was Ken Miles. He was an outstanding driver and development specialist. He had been instrumental in the Shelby racing program and in the development of the 427 Cobra and the GT350. In August of 1966, while testing the new Ford GT-J car at Riverside, he crashed and was killed.
Ken Miles, God rest his soul, the GT40s would never have reached the pinnacle that they reached without Ken Miles. He was the ultimate long-distance racer. He could go very quickly if he had to, but he was the ultimate as far as long-distance racing is concerned. I've never had a loss that hit me as hard as when we lost Ken. He was not only a friend, but he was a good engineer. He was a good test driver. He was as good a race driver as I ever knew. And I can't say what a void I felt when we lost him.
Shelby returned to Le Mans in 1967 to once again head up the Ford Assault. Remembering that race gives him a chance to talk about his close friend, Dan Gurney.
The greatest, I'm sure Dan wouldn't agree, or A.J. Foyt wouldn't agree, but the greatest drive that I've ever seen Dan put together was when he won Le Mans for us in a Ford GT in 1967. Foyt had just won Indianapolis. Foyt, you know, still had the fire in his belly. Gurney played it so cool and so smart. He never went within 15 seconds of how fast he could go in practice. And he did that for a reason. He knew Foyt would try to go faster. And he played it like that. He never, ever, even during the race, went anywhere near his limit. He drove such a beautiful race. All the rest of the Fords blew up. Gurney and Foyt held it together and won the race, which I think is as great a race as Foyt ever drove, too. And I've seen him drive a lot of them because he kept himself in check, although he wanted to go fast. Gurney kept himself in check. And while everybody else dropped by the wayside, they won the race. And to me, that just shows you what a bright individual that Dan Gurney is, and I will thank him for that to my dying day.
The Le Mans race in '67, my final race at Le Mans, I had been there 6 times prior to that, and had managed to lead the race and been great contenders and had some great teammates. But to be there, be real contenders, and share the car with A.J. Foyt, who I admired a great deal and was maybe the greatest oval racer ever, although he's certainly among the top 4 or 5, and has won more still today IndyCar races than anyone else. Was a tremendous, I think, as a patriot and as some guy liked to wave the flag once in a while, was a terrific occasion. And but I think my previous experience, where I had been there 6 times and had almost always been beaten by another older fellow, Briggs Cunningham, who wasn't really well known as a race driver, but knew how to approach that race. I took a lot of hints from Briggs and applied that to my effort there in '67 and convinced AJ that our philosophy should be, it's not a race, it's an endurance contest. Well, we did, regardless of what Ford said to us, and I don't think Ford realized. We were voted the least likely to succeed, I'm sure. And of course, by applying what was Briggs's philosophy, next thing you know, we had a tremendous lead, and we won the race and set new records and won the index of performance, which had to do with mileage as well. I mean, we just smoked the dickens out of everybody, and it was a great day.
For Carroll Shelby, the dream had been realized. He had won a world championship, numerous national championships, and had taken Ford to the winner's circle at Le Mans twice. But the world and the cars he was building were changing.
I had a beautiful relationship with Ford in the earlier years. if we needed something, if we needed an engine built down the assembly line with a couple hundred at a time with another 100 horsepower, they did it for us. Wonderful people that we worked with in engineering. As it progressed and Ford got into serious racing themselves and spending a lot of money, there was a lot of jealousy due to the fact that we were an outside company. We were getting all these good pieces and parts, and created a lot of jealousy. And it wasn't as much pleasure as it was in the beginning. However, I have to say, in all honesty, I would never have been able to do what we did, or we would never have been able to do what we did if it hadn't been for Ford.
With any factory or any big corporation, there's also a concept that they have that they call not invented here. That if it didn't come out of their corporate boardrooms or from the ideas of somebody, they fight very hard against it. I think partially that's just human nature. They don't want someone else to take credit for things that they're doing, but they also don't want to risk the company name on something that might not be successful, because if Carroll Shelby were a failure, Ford's name would have been dragged down with him.
Very fond memories for a lot of the people at Ford, the Homer Perrys and the people that were not only helpful, but were there anytime we needed them, and made it possible to go to engineering and get what we needed on very short notice, and helped us in every way they could.
Ford doesn't always get the credit that it deserved, and Carroll Shelby is quick to admit that. He says that there were a lot of people at Ford that helped him, that he would not have been able to do what he did without their help, and yet they get overlooked in the journalistic shorthand when someone writes an article and it says, Shelby wins Le Mans. It's much easier to write one headline like that than it is to say Shelby, along with Ford, along with drivers, along with designers and stylists and engineers and everybody else. It gets too wieldy. And so the journalists would come along and just say Shelby wins Le Mans, and the people at Ford would not feel too good about that. They feel like they're not getting the respect or the credit that they deserve. And to an extent, I think that's true.
In 1967, by year's end, production on the Cobra was halted. And the Shelby Mustangs, which in the beginning were hairy-chested muscle cars, had begun an evolutionary cycle in 1966 that had made them more civilized. 1,000 GT350s were built that year for Hertz Rent-A-Car. Most were black and gold, and all of them carried the GT350H designation. An adult Hertz customer could rent a Shelby Mustang for a few bucks more than an LTD would have cost for the weekend. In 1967, the Shelby GT500 was introduced, powered by the Ford 428 big block engine. But both the GT350s and 500s were getting bigger and heavier. Meanwhile, Ford had a stronger hand in the positioning of the Shelby-built vehicles in the marketplace. Performance was now only an incidental, rather than an essential component in the game plan. And the government was beginning to cast a jaundiced eye at cars that proclaimed their performance credentials and racing bloodlines. So on October 4th, 1969, Carroll Shelby announced his retirement from the world of high-performance automobiles.
It ended about 1970 because performance went away. The Mustang was getting too heavy. You had to fool with environmental problems, emissions, and so forth, that we had to clean the environment up, but there was nothing to do. There weren't any interesting cars you could build, so I went to Africa for 10 years. I wanted to see Africa before it was gone. And I'm glad that I went then, because it'll be impossible to do in the 90s in Africa what I did in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, and that's see Africa as Africa was.
The Cobras came along right at the beginning of the end, right before the federal government got involved with with safety aspects, forcing car makers to reach certain standards. I'm not going to make a value judgment whether that was good or bad. It certainly killed the Cobra, because in order to meet those standards, the Cobra would have had to become a different car than it was. And I think Shelby had enough foresight to let the Cobra die right where it was, instead of continuing to build it and to emasculate it, you know, to reduce its effectiveness a little bit every year just to meet some arbitrary requirement. And so, you know, he went out with a bang. The car, the last Cobra that was built was faster than the first Cobra that was made, and you don't see that with a lot of car projects.
God, those were great days. One week Chrysler had come out with another muscle car, and the next week Chevy had come out with another muscle car, and the next week Pontiac, and the next week Ford, and the next week Buick. We had some interesting cars back there then.
And Carroll Shelby's proud legacy of performance might have reached its ultimate conclusion 20 years ago, had it not been for a phone call in 1981 from an old friend.
When Iacocca went to Chrysler, we started talking about putting some kind of little situation together, but they didn't have two pennies to rub together. So we finally got together last part of '81, and all we had was a little four-cylinder engine. We started playing with mirrors and trying to announced the world that that was a performance car, and we built some pretty good cars.
At a secret base in California, a renowned designer of modern race cars is developing a new generation of weapons for Dodge. His name, Carroll Shelby. The names of his weapons: Daytona, Lancer, Omni GLH, and Shelby Charger. These are Dodge's performance weapons. And each is available with turbocharging, which gives Dodge more turbocharged models than any American car maker. And gives you further proof that Dodge is an American revolution.
We can handle 250 horsepower in a little 2,000, 2,200-pound car without any problems with the steering.
Dodge Omni has always been a good old buddy. A nice little guy. Loyal, efficient. Well, we got this kind of sneaky idea. First, we gave it a sleek new coat of jet black. We put 15-inch alloy wheels and performance rubber on it. Beefed up the suspension quite a bit. The final touch, a real screamer under the hood. Dodge's high-output Shelby engine with optional turbo power. Darn if we didn't come up with one of the fastest production cars in America. Dodge Omni GLH. No more Mr. Nice Guy.
The Chrysler-Shelby collaboration soon resulted in a new generation of muscle cars. Cars which packed power and punch from smaller, more fuel-efficient engines, and handling that could match all but a few of the most expensive imports in the world. With turbocharging and intercooling, Shelby proved that there may, after all, be a substitute for cubic inches.
It's hard to talk somebody into that's responsible for the money to let you spend $100 million, build another cylinder head, and another $200 million to tool it up. But we're coming along with things like the Dodge Spirit with the old four-cylinder engine, 225 horsepower, wonderful four-door sedan. As good a performing four-door sedan as there is in the world today. There are a lot of very interesting cars now coming out, but I'm afraid that that we're entering into another era of the bureaucrats in Washington forcing us to go back to four-cylinder engines, trying to raise the mileage up to something that's unconscionable. I'm afraid that we're entering that again. So just as we're beginning to have a little fun again, in spite of emissions, in spite of all the safety stuff that have been brought out, which I'm not degrading, we needed upbraiding a little bit in the industry, but we've accepted all that, and we're building interesting cars, and now they started yelling about, oh, now we got to double the mileage. We've got to the cafe, the safety aspects. So I hope they don't run it again, but I don't have much hope that the bureaucrats aren't going to screw it up. You can't let the Naderites tell you what to build in an automobile when the public's the one that has to buy them. So if you listen to all these environmentalists and these bureaucrats, they would flat put us out of the automobile business because they don't give a hoot what the public wants to buy. They want to jam it up the public's behind what they're going to get.
Carroll Shelby underwent heart transplant surgery in late 1990, and the successful outcome restored much of the energy and enthusiasm that his ailing heart had robbed him of. 2 projects, besides his Goodyear tire distributorship, now occupy the lion's share of his thoughts and efforts. One is the automobile that has been called the 427 Cobra reincarnate, the Viper.
I drove it the other day at the test track in Phoenix quite extensively. I can tell you for sure that it's a worthy successor to the Cobra, and it's a hell of an automobile. I'm tickled to death with it. The guys have done a terrific job of putting it together. It's going to be just about what the 427 Cobra was 30 years ago. It's still going to be a wind-in-the-face sport car, but it's got some improvements. Suspension, brakes, a few more of the creature comforts, but I am very, very happy to be associated with it, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot of test driving in it the next year while we're getting into production.
His second project is the Spec Racer, which he builds and distributes from his Southern California facility, a car that competes in its own Sports Car Club of America series, the Shelby Can-Am.
There aren't any American drivers in Formula One and in Europe anymore. And yet there's a whole bunch of American drivers that are capable of being in Formula One. And I built the Can-Am car so that we can have a cheap car that young Americans can get into after they race their little Formula Renaults for a season or so, and they can find out and people can see whether they have any ability or not, so that they can move on up to Indianapolis and Formula One.
It's been over 25 years since the days when Carroll Shelby and his team tore holes in the air with the brute force of their handiwork. But his life and time still provide great enjoyment to the many members of the club that bears his name.
The Shelby Automobile Club, run by Rick Kopech and Ken Eber, is the greatest club that there is anywhere. And it's a wonderful automobile club for the simple reason that they own it and they don't get in squabbles all the time about who's going to be president next year, like all the other clubs do. They do a wonderful job of running it. They do a wonderful job of keeping this interest alive on these cars. And we were very fortunate that the cars came along right in the middle of the muscle car era, and then they went away in the 70s. And nobody's been able to build any cars like that again.
Most members see Carroll Shelby as the patriarch of a big family, and our national conventions are more like family reunions. Carroll Shelby is in private the way he is in public. He doesn't put on a false face or an affected persona. He talks to you, and within 5 minutes you get the feeling that he's telling you things that he wouldn't tell anyone else. And that's not put on. He's not, you know, trying to get his arm around your shoulder or his hand in your pocket. It's just the way he is. I think part of it is from being from Texas, and part of it is being a good old boy and really enjoying his position and his what he's accomplished. He's very, very confident and very comfortable with it. He comes to our conventions, and he'll meet someone last year that had a '67 Shelby with an oil leak in it. And the guy will be a little nervous, and he'll say, well, my car leaks a little oil, it smokes a little bit, but I'm going to get the engine rebuilt next year. And the following year, they'll meet again at the convention, and Carroll Shelby will say to this guy, John, how's your GT500 engine? Did you get it rebuilt yet? And it knocks the guy right out of his socks, because he wouldn't have dreamed that Shelby would remember him after a full year. I think one of Carroll Shelby's secret pleasures in this club are the number of people who name their kids after him. Either Carroll Shelby Smith or Shelby Smith or Carroll Smith. It's amazing that people are that deeply involved. And I can recall at one convention, the wife of a member came up to me trying to get some sympathy and said, you know, he's 3 years old, his name is Shelby Jones. What do I tell him when he's 15 and he asks where he got his name? I have to say that his father was interested in a certain kind of a car, and that's what we named him after. And I just told her, it's a good thing that your husband wasn't interested in Studebakers.
And as Carroll Shelby moves ever closer to a 6th decade of helping to define the boundaries of driving excitement, he is careful not to dwell too stubbornly on the accomplishments of yesterday.
I've had a lot of highs. Winning Le Mans as a driver, building the Cobra, winning the World Championship. Really, there's been so many of them that I can't decipher which was the most thrilling. The thing that's the most thrilling to me is the fact that I'm sitting here with a new heart, 34, 35 years old, and I'm still able to build what I want to build, and I want to cut back and have fun doing, instead of trying to build a lot of cars, I want to do what I've always wanted to do. That's build a few of them the way I want to build them for little niche markets, and be a part of the thing like the Viper, be a part of Chrysler's overall plans as far as product is concerned. I don't think that I'm past it in that. That's the highlight of my life. What's going to happen tomorrow?
In that golden age of horsepower, when broad-shouldered V8s that rippled with high-compression muscle tore at the pavement and filled the air with deep-throated voices warning of their intentions, there were indeed cars that rewrote the laws of physics with acceleration that could knock you senseless, and racetrack credentials that many cars with much longer lineages zealously envy. Carroll Shelby tipped the performance world upside down with his motley crew of West Coast hot rodders. They weren't interested in making history, yet they made it. They didn't care about creating legends, and yet their legends still shine brightly. They wanted to be the fastest, and having done that, they wanted to be champions. And in that brief, glittering snapshot of history, Carroll Shelby saw his dreams and the dreams of those around him come to pass in a land where giants once roamed.